Hey folks, what we're going to look at today is organizing data and probability and how to organize that data and how to calculate probability from data that we've organized. So here I've just given a question. It says, draw a tree diagram to organize the outcomes of flipping a coin and rolling a four-sided dice. So I have a coin here and then a four-sided dice, which looks like this triangle. Whatever number's on top is what you rolled, so a 3 there. And it says use a tree diagram. And reviewing from last year, remember when we use a tree diagram, we want to have our two events, right? Our first event, and as you found out from definitions, these are two independent events. Our first event is, say, flipping a coin. So the outcomes for flipping a coin could be heads or it could be tails. And what I want to do is create a tree diagram from that. So if I flipped a heads, what is the possibilities I could get on my die? Well, I could roll a heads and a 1, a heads and a 2, a heads and a 3, and a heads and a 4. But what if I flip a tails? Well, the same outcomes are possible on my dice. So I could, if I get a tails, I could get a 1, I could get a 2, I could get a 3, and I could get a 4. And this is what our total outcomes are. And if you want to organize this a little further, we could say you could get a heads 1, heads 2, heads 3, heads 4. Tails 1, tails 2, tails 3, tails 4. And this would be our sample space. Remember, sample space. This is our sample space of this. These are all the possible outcomes. There are 8 outcomes. And if you noticed, in our first section, we had 2 outcomes. And in our second section, we had 4 outcomes. And 2 times 8 2 times 4, sorry about that. 2 times 4 is equal to 8, which is, this is total outcomes. And this should all be review from grade 7, but we're looking at 2 times 4 because there are 2 possibilities with this, a heads and a tails. And times 4, 4 possibilities here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So 2 times 4 is equal to 8. That shows us total outcomes or total sample size. So tree diagram is the first way, and that's really handy if you have more than just 2 events. The second way is to draw a table. Well, the table could look like this, where one of your outcomes goes along the side here, the other down here, heads and tails, and the other event, so this was the coin and the die, will go up here, and you're going to make something like a multiplication table, right, where you have, oh my goodness, I cannot write today, 3 and 4. There you go. So you could get a heads 1, heads 2, heads 3, heads 4. You could get a tails 1, tails 2, tails 3, tails 4. And that will be our total amount of outcomes here. So where we have a coin and a die. So this is organizing in a table. This is a tree diagram. And whichever way is best for you to solve is great. Sometimes I'll ask you, and we're going to get a way where we could maybe not have to draw these every time later this week or next week. Then it says calculate this is probability of getting a heads and a 1. Remember, our formula for probability is equal to favorable outcomes divided by the total amount of outcomes. Like so. So if we have favorable outcomes divided by total amount of outcomes, our favorable outcomes, the ones we want, how many heads 1s are there? Well, there's only 1 here. So a heads 1, so there's 1 favorable outcome over total amount of outcomes. There are 8. So there's 1 out of 8 possibilities. And we could show this as a fraction, Or we could say this as a percentage, which is 12.5%. Or you could say this as a decimal, 0.125. And this is how we show probability. Our second thing is probability of getting a heads, 1, or a 3. Well, probability is equal to favorable or total. Favorable outcomes, well, we want a heads 1. Well, I got that circled here already. But we want a 1 or a 3. So a 1 or a 3 is going to be there, which is 2 out of 8. Now, when we have a fraction, we could reduce it to 1 out of 4, which equals 25%. And this will help you solve the worksheet I've given you. Again, organizing data in a tree diagram or a table. We could calculate total amount of outcomes by just multiplying the amount of outcomes of one event by the amount of outcomes of the second event to get total 8 outcomes. And finally, this will all help us calculate the probability of an event happening, such as getting a heads and a 1.